Good morning, Dr. Neeta Mathur, Department of English, Shri Gobind Singh Gurjar, Government College, Nasirabad. Continuing the discussion about the poem, the sonnet, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds by William Shakespeare. Yesterday we looked at the line-wise detailed meaning of the poem. Today let us try and analyze the poem. First, symbolism, imagery and allegory. The first symbol, marriage. The idea of marriage is present in the background of this poem from the very first line. However, the poet does not necessarily define marriage the way people typically do, as a religious sacrament or a legal procedure. Instead, he emphasizes a more idealistic, transcendent vision of it. The marriage described in this poem is not a formal contract. Rather, it is a marriage of true minds, a phrase that suggests a deep understanding between two equals rather than a mere legal bond. In Shakespeare's time, marriage was far from an association between two equally powerful and independent people. Women were basically surrendered into the control of their husbands when they got married. The relationship that Sonnet 116 discusses certainly does not conform to this conventional view of marriage. Instead of talking about the importance of obedience or subservience in married life, it focuses on faithfulness, forgiveness, and equality in any loving relationship. Take a look at lines 1 and 2. The opening two lines. The poem alludes directly to the Church of England's official marriage service. Before a couple can be officially married, the priest asks the gathered congregation if there is any impediment, which means hindrance or obstacle, to the marriage. The poet sees none here. Next is navigation. Let us analyze the symbol. The idea of love as a guiding star is not a new one. But in this poem, Shakespeare approaches it with a renewed enthusiasm. The poem's central extended metaphor is the comparison of love to a star, specifically the North Star, which does not ever change position in the night sky. This made it particularly important to sailors who calculated the location of their ships based on the stars. The North Star provided a stable point around which the other stars appeared to revolve, making it central to navigation for centuries. The poet uses nautical imagery to construct the mental picture of love as a star leading all of us through life. In lines 5 to 8, for example, in line 5, the declaration that love is an ever fixed mark introduces this extended metaphor of love as a star to which we all look. The poet also goes a step further into figurative language land, and personifies this love star, saying that it looks on tempests and is never shaken. Line 6. And later, that the star's worth is unknown, although his height be taken. Line 8. The idea of love as a star guiding the rest of the world really takes off in lines 6 and 7. The tempests that threaten the seas are a metaphor for the challenges and vicissitudes, means sudden changes in life, that may plague a relationship, like arguments or infidelity. While in line 7, the wandering bark is a metaphor for the lover being led through the tumultuous sea of life by love. The word wandering also personifies this lost ship, giving us the feeling that it is looking for something. The next symbol is time, age, and death. The macabre image of the Grim Reaper was quite familiar to Shakespeare's Elizabethan readers. Now, the Grim Reaper is a disguised person who holds a scythe in his hand, and his main business is to kill, to get rid of. The skeletal scythe-bearing figure of death, the Grim Reaper in other words is death, became an icon of European culture in the medieval period, in which death was a horrifyingly present part of everyday life. We can blame the devastating impact of the Black Plague for that, just like now it is the COVID-19 which is devastating the world. This image of death has stuck with Western civilization ever since and is commonly invoked in poetry and art to remind us all of our own mortality. However, in this poem, the reaper, referred to simply as time, actually loses. It turns out that love is the one thing that can resist the power of death. If we look at lines 9 and 10 in this context, the poet personifies both love and time here, claiming that love isn't a court jester at the beck and call of time. In other words, time cannot play with love. It is an allusion, means a reference to the medieval conception of death as a character known as King Death, an allegorical figure that represented the Black Plague, more familiar to us as the figure of the Grim Reaper, here brought to mind by the mention of the bending sickle. Line 10. Finally, the phrase sickles compass come in line 10 makes use of alliteration, means the repetition of sound, to bring home the idea of passing time. The harsh C sounds mimic the ticking of a clock in an onomatopoeic way. Onomatopoeia again means repetition of sound. In lines 11 and 12, the his in line 11 signifies that the brief hours and weeks belong to time. His here is time. In other words, time is personified as a man, continuing the personification of this concept that we saw in lines 9 and 10. This notion that time has no control over love is emphasized in this line, since the passing of time has no effect whatsoever upon true love. Now let us take a look at the form and meter of the poem. Elizabethan, in other words Shakespearean sonnet, iambic pentameter. Let us tackle the simpler part first, that is the meter. This sonnet, like all of the other sonnets and like Shakespeare's plays, is written in iambic pentameter. This is a fancy way of explaining the consistent da-dum, da-dum, da-dum rhythm of the lines. Every line has 5 two-syllable feet. Yes, that is what they are actually called, or iambs. Penta means 5 in Greek. Each of these feet is one of the dadam. The dum is stressed. In other words, there are two syllables. The weak, that is da, followed by a strong, that is dum. In other words, dum is the stress syllable. It is the stronger syllable. Altogether, every line has 10 syllables. 5 iams times 2 syllables per iam is equal to 10 syllables in total. A perfect example is line 5. Italicized syllables are stressed. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark. Now that we have got the meter down, let us take a look at the form. Sonnet 116 is, well, a sonnet. The sonnet, a 14-line poetic form that originated in medieval Italy, made its way over to England through the very popular poems of Petrarch, who was an Italian poet, and Ronsard, a French poet. These European sonnets followed a rhyme scheme referred to now as the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. However, once it got to England, in the 16th century, British poets started to shake things up a bit. In other words, British poets like Spenser and Shakespeare made changes to suit them. Shakespeare's sonnets are all written in a different rhyme scheme than their continental predecessors. Predecessors means those who came before Shakespeare. The so-called English sonnet, which is also known as the Elizabethan sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet, is divided into 3 quatrains, means stanzas of 4 lines each, which in turn have 2 rhymes. The whole poem follows the rhyme scheme: AB AB first quatrain, CD CD second quatrain, EF EF the third quatrain. In our example, minds and finds are the A rhyme in stanza 1, and love and remove are the B rhyme in stanza 2. Mark and bark are C, while shaken and taken are D, etc. etc. Finally, the last 2 lines, that is line 13 and 14, are grouped together as a couplet and rhyme with each other. If they were added on to the scheme we wrote out above, they would be GG, proved and loved in Sonnet 116. The words in inverted commas here are the last words of each line, the sound of which match each other. For example, line 1 and 3 have the same ending sound. Line 2 and 4 have the same ending sound, therefore A, B, A, B, and so on. Shakespeare wrote so many sonnets of this form that we now commonly call it the Shakespearean sonnet. The final characteristic of this sonnet is the turn or the volta. These are really just fanciful words for a simple shift in gears, meaning changing of the style, which usually happens in the first line of the third quatrain, between lines 8 and 9, when some change in ideas enters into the poem. That is, at line 8, the octave is ending, and at line 9, the sestet is beginning. This sonnet is no exception to this rule. The turn occurs at love is not time's fool, that is line 9, where the image of love as a guiding star is suddenly replaced by a personification of love as an eternal, everlasting force that resists death, introducing the idea of the immortality of love. Let us analyze the speaker next. This guy, we know it's a man, has been through the wringer with love. Wringer is that appliance with which you use to squeeze the cloth, wet cloth, just like you have in the washing machines. So here love is the wringer, okay, and emerged with a clearer understanding of it. He is absolutely certain that the vision of love he depicts here is the right one, and he is willing to stake his reputation as a poet on it. We get the feeling that the speaker has experienced what he thinks of as the marriage of true minds, only also known as true love, that his love remains strong and that he believes that it is eternal. What with all the ships and stars and stormy seas that fill the landscape of the poem, we imagine him in full-on, rather melodramatic English poet mode, gazing out to sea with fiery eyes, half hidden beneath a floppy, feather-bedecked velvet hat, cursing fate and vowing his undying love to some distant lover. Something along the lines of the end of Shakespeare in Love. I'm sure you get the picture. We suspect that he has been there and done that. In other words, this is not a first time experience for him, and is now relating what he has learned from life to a younger listener. However, before you give us all the credit for this brilliant analysis, we should come clean. That is, let me be honest about it. This isn't just our interpretation of the speaker. Actually, it is a common view of the relationship between poet and the addressee, that is, the person he's talking to, which means you and I, the readers. In Shakespearean circles, there's a general consensus, that is, people agree generally on the appearance of several figures in the sequence of sonnets. They aren't exactly characters, which is why this information does not appear in the characters sections, because they are not really a part of the poem. They are more like the ideas of people rather than actual people. The first is the poet himself, identified as Shakespeare, but not necessarily directly aligned with him. The poems may or may not be autobiographical. It is uncertain. The next figure that we see is the so-called fair youth, the subject of sonnets 1 to 126. These sonnets are addressed to a young man whose relationship of the poet is somewhat unclear. Some people read these sonnets as expressions of platonic love and affection, while others have questioned whether or not there are clues to a gay relationship here. Whatever the scene may be, the two final figures who don't relate to our discussion of Sonnet 116 are the Dark Lady, a mistress of the poet's sonnets 127 to 154, and the rival poet who appears in sonnets 78 to 86. Now a look at the setting. While we cannot put our finger on a real setting for this poem for an obvious reason, because there isn't one. There are no events that take place and no actual places referenced at all. However, the poem does create a specific imaginary space through its key use of nautical imagery. The poet creates a vivid scene in the minds of his readers by conjuring up the mental picture of a storm-tossed sea, a lost ship, and above it all, the calm, unchanging, and dependable pole star, also known as the North Star. This dramatic scene provides a kind of visual metaphor for the poem's interpretation of love as a guiding light above a troubled world. Now, an analysis of the sound check. This poem manages to sound both consistently rhythmic and conversational, formal and casual, planned and spontaneous. Faithful watchers of the series Law and Order or any other courtroom drama might recognize this mash-up, means this mix-up of different tones from the masterful and persuasive arguments often featured on such programs. We usually see them delivered by attractive and brilliant lawyers, or rather attractive actors portraying brilliant lawyers. Here we might imagine the poet in this role, that of a lawyer, delivering a well-crafted, carefully paced and yet accessible argument to a jury of readers. That is, you and I will judge the presentation of the poet. The poem's meter, iambic pentameter, becomes very apparent from line 3 onward. You can check in the section form and meter for more on this, creating a certain feeling of consistent pacing. But certain elements of drama, like the "oh no" in line 5, break it up and remind us that this is a real person talking, not a machine. Just like any good appeal to a jury, the poem uses clear and simple language to get its point across and to illustrate its claims. Finally, the conducting couplet, which even engages legal language in the phrase "upon me proved" in line 13, is an ideal, perfect closing statement. It is bold, challenging, and memorable. Now, the calling card of the poem. Its clarity, consistency of form, and in a word, its perfection. There is a reason Shakespeare is Shakespeare, if you understand what I'm trying to say. You don't become the most famous and widely beloved poet of the English language by writing shoddy, means badly written, confusing verse. Working within the strict, somewhat stiff constraints of the sonnet form. Remember, he only has the space of 14 lines, not more, not less. He produced poems that are simultaneously high-flown and down-to-earth. While they do employ what we all think of as Shakespearean language. You know, the whole "doth thou thinkest me not a wondrous poet" kind of thing. The sonnets are notable for their frankness and clarity. This one in particular is recognizable for its very simple language, that is, for Shakespeare's times particularly, elegant structure and logical flow. Sonnet 116 deals more with the emotional side of the love word rather than its physical consequences. The poet defines an idealized marriage of two minds, line 2, a relationship that may or may not be physical. Now, something that is crying aloud for everybody. When poets refer to other great works like this one, people and events, it's usually not accidental. This poem is not remembered and read and reread down the ages just by chance. You have to understand why it is Shakespeare who is the poet who has written this poem. Other shout-outs are the reference to the Anglican marriage service in line 1 and 2 for contemporary text, etc. Also the reference to Polaris, the North Star. In other words, Shakespeare had the knowledge of religion and geography, or call it what you like. That's all for today. We will continue in the next lecture. Thank you and goodbye.